Marella Amato joins me this week to discuss judging beer. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 174. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 174, and it's late July 2018. This week, Marella Amato joins me to discuss judging beer. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They have a new Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine podcast, which I encourage you to check out. It features some of the top brewery owners and brewmasters discussing brewing techniques and flavors in beer. It's the podcast for those who make and drink great beer. You can find it on iTunes or at beerandbrewing.com/podcasts. And also the new Brew Vision thermometer from Bleakman Engineering. This interactive wireless digital thermometer connects right to your iPhone or iPad and lets you remotely monitor and record temperatures. You can download your recipes right from the BeerSmith cloud and set updates and alerts as you brew. Get the Brew Vision Bluetooth thermometer today, another great innovation from BleakmanEngineering.com. Again, that's BleakmanEngineering.com. And finally, BeerSmith 3 is available now for download. BeerSmith 3 adds Mead, wine, and cider support to the BeerSmith platform, along with new integrated water profile and mash pH tools for beer brewers. Dozens of new features, including cloud folders, updated databases, support for fruit, juice, honey, as well as new Whirlpool hop options. Download your free 21-day trial of BeerSmith 3 today from BeerSmith.com. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome Marella Amato. Mirella is a national-level Bjcp certified beer judge and one of the very few master cicerones in the world. She's also the author of the book Idealogy and runs a website at beerology.ca. Mirella, it is great to have you on the show. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Our first-time guest, you're coming to us from Toronto today, I believe, right?
I am.
How are things
Toronto.
Up in the Great White North there?
It's a fantastic city to live in. It's just been blooming in the past while in all aspects. You know, we are a city of immigrants. I think last statistic was at least half, if not more, of the people in Toronto were not born here. And so it's just a richness of culture and foods. And now the craft beer is getting very interesting too. So it's wonderful.
Yeah, I grew up about 60 miles south of there in Rochester, New York, so not far away. Been to Toronto many times. What is going on with the Canadian beer scene? Is it kind of paralleling what's going on here? Are you seeing an explosion of craft beer breweries?
Absolutely. It's been quite a similar path, actually. Our first craft brewery here was in 1982. Which I believe was also the first brew pub in North America, Horseshoe Bay Brewery, founded by John Mitchell, who is a fantastic guy, still kicking around. I see him whenever I can. And, you know, I've been in the industry now for 11 years, 12 years. And when I started, things were very regional still. We have our alcohol regulations are provincial, so each province and territory regulates its own alcohol distribution. And in addition to that, we have some very strict rules about interprovincial beers crossing interprovincial
transfers,
borders.
So
a lot of breweries find it actually easier to export to Europe or to the US than to distribute into other provinces. So as a result of that, among other things, there were pockets. And so in 2007, when I started, there was a number of breweries on the West Coast in BC, Ontario, and Quebec were the three, more, important beer scenes in terms of volume. And BC and Quebec both had a strong U.S. influence. BC, obviously, because it's just north of where the craft beer movement started in the U.S. And in fact, I know John Mitchell, who founded our first brewery, went down to the U.S. and was helping breweries down there. There was a lot of back and forth. And in Quebec, there was a strong ties with Vermont breweries and, Greg Noonan and all those wonderful people down there. Meanwhile, in Ontario, where I am, where Toronto is, there was still a very strong English, UK-influenced beer culture at the time. And I still remember the first beer that came out here that was regularly available in bottles that had American hops in it didn't come out till 2009.
Oh, wow.
Which is quite late. And I still remember the first time I had a beer with American hops in it. I was like, what is this flavor? So that's one side of it. But on the other side of it, which I think is interesting to note for those who haven't been to Ontario, this strong UK influence gave us a thriving cask conditioned ale movement. So when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I could get cask conditioned ale almost anywhere. It was really widespread, and it's still very strong. I'm part of a cask conditioned ale advocacy group called Cask. We have one of the largest, if not the largest, cask conditioned ale festival in North America called Cask Days. So that's one of our strengths, and we've kept that, which is fantastic. But at this stage, I would say things have sped up, and Canada pretty much is, in the same place as the U.S., a very rich culture, a little bit more uniform across the country, with everyone doing very interesting and innovative things. And at this stage, I think we have breweries in all provinces and territories. We're waiting on one in Nunavut. Mm-hmm. It's been in construction since 2015, and it's threatening to open any minute. But once it does, then we will have craft breweries everywhere, which is exciting, because road trips are awesome and local beer is great.
Are you seeing the explosion of IPAs like we are here in the United States? I think here in the United States, some of the craft breweries, more than half the beer they're selling is IPAs now.
Absolutely. And, the milkshake IPAs and the New England IPAs and all the different variations, for sure. Yeah, at this stage. And, other things as well. I think right now we're seeing a swell of Gozes and Berliner Weiss, which I'm also seeing in the U.S. And so that's also coming up. And, generally, breweries are bringing in cool ships and barrels and just tons of delicious things to drink. So many beers, so little time. So little time.
Well, you are a certified BJCP beer at the national level, I believe.
Yes.
What does that mean? We're going to talk about the BJCP program today and beer judging.
So the BJCP program, BJCP being Beer Judge Certification Program, certifies beer judges. And there are a number of different levels in the program, which I think is fantastic. Mm-hmm. So it means that someone who's just starting to judge can get certified. And then as you gain both experience and knowledge, you can move through the different levels. So at the national level, it means I scored at least an 80% on my written exam. And I have at least 20 judging points. So you accumulate judging points by judging in various competitions. It took me about 2 years, and I judged 12. I was doggedly going for those points. So I judged 12 competitions in those 2 years and managed to get up to the national level. And for me, more importantly, being a national level judge means that I can get more involved in the program. So once you get to a certain level, then you have the ability, for example, to proctor exams. Mm-hmm. So when they do tasting exams, the program is just fantastic. I love everything about how it's structured. So when you're doing a tasting exam, you're sitting for the exam, you're tasting beers, and at the same time, there will be 2 or 3 higher level judges, usually national and above, who are proctoring. And what they're doing essentially is tasting the same beers as you in the exact same conditions and taking notes, so that the person then grading the exam has these detailed notes from people who were in exactly the same situation as you and tasted exactly the same thing as you, and that informs how they score your exams. So mm-hmm. I've been proctoring for a number of years, and as of this year, I've started grading exams as well, which is really fun. I'm learning a lot.
Well, I want to get into that some more in a minute, but I wanted to ask you why is the ability to judge beer so critical for homebrewers? I think this is sort of the nub of things.
Yeah, I think for homebrewers, it's not so much the ability to judge, but the judging experience. I've been judging since 2007, and tasting really is a group activity. If you taste in a group, you always learn a lot more. And at this stage, I'm often one of the more advanced judges at the table, but I still go out of my way to go to larger competitions, international competitions, like, for example, the European Beer Star, where I'm judging German Pilsners alongside 6 German brewmasters, I'm bound to learn something, right? Or, something like the World Beer Cup, where I have, a range of people around me. And in conversation, you learn a lot about beers. But for homebrewers specifically, I think what's important is this experience where you're able to taste, for example, you talked about IPAs earlier. There are many different ways to interpret an IPA, and to have that experience of sitting down and tasting 7 different interpretations. Sometimes you'll taste 7 more in the afternoon, maybe up to 20 in a day, and to really start understanding the nuances of where that style can go and understand where you want to take it. I think it's just really important. And then again, the other piece is understanding a range of styles and being exposed to a range of styles. The very first thing I did when I started in beer was master the Bjcp guidelines, and it's informed everything I do. And I recommend the program highly to anyone who's homebrewing.
Yeah, I find it helps me better judge my own beer, so I could make improvements, identify flaws, those kinds of things, right?
That's the other piece, and that's very important, because off flavors, if you read about it in books, you're not going to really necessarily be able to wrap your brain around what that off flavor actually tastes like until you come across it. Some, like skunk, are obvious. It smells like a skunk. There it is. But other off flavors, like, for example, acetaldehyde or DMS, unless you've encountered it in the wild, or you've taken a class, you're not necessarily going to be able to pinpoint what it is. So yes, definitely off-flavor identification is important. And I run an off-flavor class every year in a couple of different cities in Canada to help people study. But the other, very straightforward way to master off flavors and to learn to identify them is through judging and through leaning over to the person next to you and saying, "This doesn't taste right. What is this?" And then they will tell you.
Well, you're also a certified master cicerone, which is essentially a beer sommelier, if I want to say it in a different way, I guess.
It's more like it's a master sommelier.
Okay.
It's like a master sommelier. I've gotten in trouble for saying it's like
no, okay, yeah. So, I mean, how does being a beer judge tie in with that program, and how does it help you when you're serving beer, helping to improve beer, doing those kinds of things?
Well, in terms of the actually passing the exam, I would say my BGCP experience was invaluable. By the time I wrote my master's exam, I had been judging for 6 years and judging in larger competitions like the JBF and World Beer Cup for 3 years. So I'd really internalized the styles, and that touches on, every single aspect. Obviously, when you're serving beer or when you're developing a menu, an understanding of the nuances of flavors of different styles is critical. And with food pairing, it's equally as critical, because food pairing is just matching up flavors. So the more you're able to identify the different flavors, which is something that I developed through my work with the BJCP and through judging, then the easier it becomes, really.
And, of course, the BJCP program really exists in large part to provide certified judges for beer competitions. What does a typical competition look like? Because I know a lot of us, I don't even participate much in beer competitions.
Oh, my goodness. Well, on the judging side, it's, we're just sitting at a table. But what has really come to light for me in the past few years is how many people are working behind the scenes to make it all happen. So to organize a competition, obviously you need a bunch of people doing math somewhere, adding numbers. You need people pouring beers. You need people distributing beers. If there's any significant number of entries in the competition, it's a lot to keep track of. It has to be poured properly. You need, you can't have it poured and then brought in front of the judges an hour and a half later. So there's a lot of logistics that goes on behind the scenes. But as a judge, usually we will sit at the table, we'll see what category we're judging, and read through the style guidelines. So when we're judging a competition, we always judge to style. The parallel I always make is it's like a dog show, right? So German Shepherds are judged against German Shepherds to the ideal of what a German Shepherd should be, and then poodles and whatnot. So we read the style guidelines and talk about any, areas that might be a question mark, or if someone is not so familiar with the style, that's their opportunity to let people know, or if someone has a blind spot in one area of judging and this style tends to have that particular off flavor, it's another good thing to mention at that point. And then we will judge the beers in silence. And depending on the competition, there's sometimes tons of notes and sometimes little notes. But regardless, we're always providing feedback for the brewers, which is important. And once everyone's assessed everything, then we have a conversation. And that's my favorite part, because it's an opportunity to ask questions about things that you're not sure about. And it's also a really interesting exploration of the nuances of a style and really understanding, I've certainly had some interesting experiences judging, for example, in the US, where we'll judge double IPAs, for example, which are a style that was born in the US. So then, to have that conversation, then I know to defer a bit to the local judges, and then we'll switch to best bidders, for example, and then I'll be sharing a bit more of my perspective and what I've learned, or for example getting into pilsners and talk about what I learned in Germany. And it's really an ongoing journey of discovery, and what makes me tick is learning things and sharing what I've learned. So that conversation really is what that's all about, and it's fantastic. And then while we're doing that, of course, we also have to choose which beer is best.
So you sit in a panel. I want to get through some of the logistics here too as well. How many people are on a typical panel? And I assume you're just judging one particular beer style at a time, right?
Right. So there's strict rules. And yes, we're only judging one style at a time. There can be a maximum number of beers. I think the most I've seen in one flight is 12.
That's a lot of beers.
And then after a certain number of flights, you take breaks. So it's all very structured, because, we're not going to be much use to anyone if we've had consumed too much. Then the judging process stops being fair at that point. There are a minimum of 3 judges at the table, and one can be an apprentice, which is how I got my start. Just jumping in there. And that being said, it's all a very fair and even process. There's usually a table captain, but the table captain's job is not to trump everyone else. It's just to keep things moving, make sure that everyone's being acknowledged, and keep the conversation going. I very much enjoy doing table captain work.
So you're going to pick I assume, a winner and runner-ups in each style, right? And there's a scoring system used, right?
Some competitions have a scoring system, some don't. It depends on the competition. If they're BJCP sanctioned, often they do. But in larger competitions, for example, the GABF, the World Beer Cup, there's no time for math. There's too many beers, because it is a lot of math. So yes, usually we'll start by providing feedback to any brewers who have off flavors in their beers or may have enter the beer in the wrong style, which occurs every once in a while and is devastating as a judge to see. And then once we've zeroed in on the styles, the beers that are most to style, if there's only one, then that's a clear winner. But then if there are a few, then we have to really have a conversation, and that's where it gets interesting. And usually we'll pick a gold, silver, and a bronze. Many competitions don't oblige us to pick all 3. So for example, if there isn't one that is entirely to style, we can choose to only award the silver and the bronze. It upsets brewers, particularly when there were a lot of entries in the category, but I think it's an important message to send sometimes, to say, none of these really were to style. So.
And then is there a way is there a method for picking overall? Is there a best of show, or how do you pick some of the top winners?
Yeah, some competitions do have a best of show. And again, so that's another fun thing that happens as you move through the ranks. So now that I'm at a national rank, I think I'm one of, I don't want to say numbers, but there's maybe 20 of us in the country. So that means that if I'm in a competition, I'll often get picked to participate in the best of show. And that is an adventure, because what it is the top beer in each category. So now we're comparing apples and oranges. You have to sort of shift gears in your brain and try to decide, which of these beers, all of which are very tasty and brewed to style, is the winner. And that's usually an in-depth conversation and really interesting experience. And, if ever you hear that a beer won best of show in a competition, I would highly encourage you to try it, because it means it's an exceptional beer.
So is that another round where you go through and sample the beers again, I guess? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And it's a larger round. There's often more than 12 beers.
Yeah, because there's I don't know how many styles. There's a lot of styles now, over 100, yes. I think, right?
Yes. And sometimes in some competitions, I have seen a case where when you give a gold medal, you can choose whether it should go to best of show or not. So if it's gold, but it's not wow, you can just give it the gold medal. And in other competitions or in other categories, if you think a beer is just spectacular, you can move it forward. So that makes it a little less work for the people judging best of show, but it's always, a pretty extended conversation. And it's difficult to pick the best of show, and that's why they have more experienced judges at the table to do that. It's fun, though. I like all those. Some people don't enjoy the category. There's a number of categories that are more open. For example, experimental beers, which is sort of a catch-all, where you're tasting, a beer with cucumber in it and another beer with tobacco in it, and then something that was barrel-aged in mezcal, and something that's smoked and also sour, and sort of, again, comparing apples and oranges and trying to decide, who will medal. It's a lot less straightforward than, for example, judging Pilsners, where the style is very defined. And so some people prefer to judge to style, and they'll stay away from those more open categories. But I find them fascinating. And, I'm there for the conversation and to learn and to share what I know. So I always try to get into those experimental categories.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I wanted to go around and approach this from a different angle, which is what does this look like for the average home brewer? How do they actually go about, picking a competition, entering a competition, submitting their beers? Tips on that. I know there's packaging problems and other problems we run into.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because one thing that I have noticed, and that it upsets me a little bit, is a lot of homebrewers hesitate to enter their beer in competitions. And when I ask them why, they'll say, well, it's not good enough to win a medal, and I just want to, fine-tune the beer before I start entering in competitions. And of course, it's amazing to win a medal. But the other piece of entering your beer in competition, and I would argue the more important piece, is the feedback that you get from the judges. You have experienced tasters tasting your beer. Maybe there's a weird flavor in your beer that you're not sure what it is, and you've been trying to fix it. Why not give a panel of tasters the opportunity to taste it and give you some feedback? So I think, for any home brewer, it's an invaluable experience to be entering your beer into competitions and to be getting that feedback. There are certainly packaging issues, and I would say, read all the instructions carefully and follow them in terms of the entry process. It's really specific. Make sure you send the right number of beers, so on and so forth. But the other thing I would also mention, which is incredibly important, and this is more from a judging perspective, is make sure you read the guidelines and you enter your beer in the correct category. At least once in every competition, there will be a delicious beer, a really tasty beer that's entered in the wrong category. And if that happens, we just have to eliminate it, and we'll let the brewer know it's in the wrong category. But it's heartbreaking as a judge to have to do that, but it's necessary. And I became quite aware of how necessary it is. A couple of years ago, I was looking at a competition where they collapsed. So they sometimes, when there's not enough entries in a category, they'll collapse them. So that means they'll take two different categories and judge them together. So in this case, they took the American Pale Ale and the American IPA category, and they collapsed them into one category. And shocker, all of the medals went to IPAs. Because if you line up IPAs with pale ales, the IPAs will stand out. It doesn't matter how much of an experienced judge you are. It would take an incredibly sophisticated, nuanced pale ale to outshine an IPA tasted side by side. And so that's why the guidelines are so strict, and that's why we have to kick beers out, because it's not fair. If you have a beer that's slightly outside category, it might stand out in that way, in the way that those IPAs stood out next to the pale ale. So it is heartbreaking when that happens, and I would just say, there's what you intended to brew, and maybe that was a specific style, but before you enter it, taste it with looking at the guidelines and think, okay, does it fit here, or is there another category it might fit better in? And I'm sure everyone has seen it at the GABF. A beer will win in one, it's a porter and it's won the stout category, or it's labeled one way, it wins another category, and that's the brewer understanding that that's where that beer will excel based on the guidelines. So please take the time to read the guidelines and put your beer in the right category, because it's just heartbreaking when that happens.
Well, maybe tell us a little bit about the BJCP style guidelines. I think many people are familiar with it from using it in software when they're designing their recipes and so on. But how are the guidelines developed? How are they, I know they're reorganized every couple of years.
Well, yeah, not that often. And the BJCP is all volunteers, so everyone's doing their best to contribute.
I should mention, I want to mention the website real quick. It's bjcp.org is where you can find all this information. Yeah. Yes.
Fantastic website. So the guidelines are really a breakdown of different beer styles, and they will tell you, what that style should taste like, what it should look like, what the aroma should be, the overall impression. They also provide areas to clarify between two similar styles. And, there are a number of people out there who don't like this idea of styles, and they find it confining, and they just want to brew what they want to brew, and I think that's fantastic. And unfortunately, it's harder to meddle when you do that, and that's fine. I know a lot of brewers who just brew what they want and don't enter them in category, don't enter beers in category, or they'll enter it in the experimental and see what happens. But I think it's really important to understand all those different styles. Those styles have evolved in different regions based on water chemistry, over hundreds of years, some of them, just finding the right combination of ingredients that results in a delicious beer. And I think as a home brewer, or as anyone in the industry, it's really important to experience that full range of what all the different beer styles taste like, and as a home brewer to have the opportunity to brew and to try to brew all those different styles. And that's what the BJCP does, is it provides those guidelines in terms of those different styles. Because I have noticed a phenomenon recently that's worrying me a little bit. Hopefully it'll go away. And you mentioned earlier the IPA phenomenon that's going on. Well, as a judge, what I'm seeing is all these different styles slowly creeping towards becoming pale ales. So I'm seeing Pilsners with American hops, sours, let's dry hop them. All these different styles brewed with American hops, the malt bill dramatically toned down. I'm seeing a lot of English style ales now brewed with a neutral yeast, and the malt toned down. And, the craft beer movement and homebrewing and the BJCP all started because we had a lack of variety in our beer scene. And this is a fantastic movement. It's an amazing movement. It's great to be a part of it. And it worries me to start seeing this sameness now. And you're seeing it also in, these breweries. And it happens here. I'll go to a brewery and there's 6 IPAs on tap. It's like, what if I'm not in the mood for an IPA? What if it's raining out and all I want is a stout?
Yeah, I was in California a few months ago and I ordered a porter. It was supposed to be an English porter, of course, and it was more like a black IPA. And I think we're seeing that trend across the board. Everybody's kind of making everything into an IPA.
Yeah, and a lot of those beers are really tasty. But then you pop over to Germany. I was in Germany last year. I went to Munich and I had a Helles. They come in liter they come in liter glasses. And I had that liter of Helles, and I was just like, I need another one of these, because it's just, a flavor that is honed, that is, doesn't need to have American hops to be delicious. It's different, but the balance between the malt and I think, drinkers need to have the opportunity to experience all these different flavors, and brewers really should have the experience to, at the very least, taste all these flavors, and also, look into trying to brew them so that we start moving away from the sameness that is definitely creeping in.
Well, one important topic you wanted to discuss was how you develop a palate for beer flavors and pick up flaws in the beer, those kinds of things. Yes.
So in my experience, I've done public tastings with Beerology for about 10 years. So these are tastings where I will guide a group of people who are, some of them very experienced in beer, home brewers, sometimes professional brewers, but most of them not, and guide them through a tasting of 6 or 7 beers. And what I have learned through that is that there's 2 aspects to tasting beer, and it's very important to distinguish the 2. The first is perceiving flavor. So just knowing that flavor is there. The second part is identifying and communicating what that flavor is. How many times have you tasted a flavor in a beer and thought, okay, that tastes familiar, but I can't place it, right? That's quite common.
Yeah.
And what I have learned, and I can say confidently through these 10 years of doing these guided tastings, is that most people have a much better palate than they think they do. And if they're not thinking and they're just letting loose and they're chatting, they are picking out those flavors. They're just picking them out. And the more challenging piece is when you're in a very concerted fashion trying to pick them out, is being able to communicate it. So when we're talking about practicing and developing your palate, as far as I'm concerned, the bigger piece that needs development is that communication piece.
The vocabulary that goes with it, I guess, right?
Yeah, and making the connection between the flavor and the name for that flavor, and being able to do that as quickly as possible. So for me, when I started in beer, I took the BJCP guidelines. Now you can get them on your phone on an app, which is amazing. But back then I had it, printed out in a little book. And I just systematically looked for beers in each category and tasted them alongside the notes, and would read and taste and read and taste. The BJCP guidelines do provide commercial examples for each style. So the commercial examples are beers that are, fit the guidelines very well. So I would taste and read and taste and read. And then I started, tasting and writing my own notes and then comparing them. And then eventually I got to a stage where I was, fairly fluent. And that's the practice really for people who are looking to hone their palate. I have a number of activities in my book, different games that you can play in groups to just get the wheels turning and to start building that confidence with naming different attributes in beer. I also have on my website, beerology.ca, a free tasting sheet. Mm-hmm. So if you go to Tasting 101 on the top right there, there's a button to click, and there's the Beerology beer evaluation sheet. It's absolutely free. You can download it. You can use it for whatever you like. I've been delighted to see people using it at beer dinners. It's one of those 2 orange buttons on the left.
I see it, yeah. For those of you on the video.
Yes. So I've seen people using it for beer dinners at various breweries. I even had one of my brewer friends in San Diego send me a note because their sensory specialist was using them for their sensory work at the brewery, which I thought was delightful. And so that sheet is really designed to help people do a thorough evaluation. It's a good stepping stone before getting to the BJCP forms, which are a lot longer and can be overwhelming. And it's meant to help develop.
I should mention the BJCP has forms as well for judging, that they actually use for judging beer, right?
Yes. So some competitions will use those full forms, and then you have to give a grade. And add it up, and then you send it through, and people do the math, and they decide which beers move on to the next round. Mm-hmm. But my beer evaluation sheet is a great resource, entirely free. Download and use as much as you like.
Okay. Well, let's talk about some of your other activities, I guess. I want to spend a little bit of time on your book and your website here at the end. You have a book called Beerology. What sets that apart from some of the other beer books out? It is a book about beer. Obviously, it's not a home brewing book necessarily.
It is not a home brewing book, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there in terms of the fact that my experience is very different. So this beer book grew out of my experience giving guided tastings and explaining beer to people who were very new to it, and sort of understanding which pieces cause more confusion than and are not necessarily helpful, and which pieces, as beer professionals or as brewers seem obvious to us, but to beginners are not. So it's really designed as a practical guide to help people hone in on what kinds of beers they enjoy, and then how to enjoy them in terms of food pairings. The underlying theme to all of my work with Beerology is that there's a beer for every food, every mood, and every occasion. So at a beginner level, I want people to just get into craft beer and feel confident in the flavors that they like, and understanding, okay, well, I like this beer, maybe I'll also enjoy that beer. But then what I really am hoping people will start thinking about more is beer as being occasion-led, right? So for example, when we're picking a wine to have with steak, we're going to pick a different wine than if we're toasting New Year's, right? It's a different occasion, it's a different feeling, it's a different beer. And having been a huge craft beer fan, I had the good fortune of discovering craft beer first. So unlike most people who came to craft beer later on in their drinking lives, my very first introduction to beer was at a pub, local Ontario beers, tasting a range of flavors and styles. And so my experience of beer is very much, how am I feeling today? What am I eating? What am I in the mood for? And, sometimes I'm in the mood for a stout. Sometimes I'm in the mood for, it's hot out, I want a Pilsner. Sometimes I need that IPA. And sometimes I need the briskness of a sour. And so I'm trying to encourage people to think that way a little bit more. I have these playful suggestions and food pairings in there. And the whole book is laid out very differently with the drinker in mind. So the traditional way to approach beer is to explain it ale versus lager, or to start in with, these are the beers of Germany, these are the beers of the UK, these are the beers of Belgium. And, that's fine, and that's great. And it's important if you're a beer professional or if you're brewing. But, as a beer drinker, if I really like Helles, which is the German style, I may not like a Dunkelweizen. Right? Mm-hmm. Whereas, I might enjoy an English summer ale. So trying to group the beers by flavors. And then I have this whole section called Diving In, where you can, it has a very long explanation of how to pair beer with food, very detailed, not if you have this, pair it with this, if you have that, pair it with how to do it. Tasting exercises to hone your palate. Quick and easy beer and cheese, so you can have a little fun at home, how to serve it. Everything you need to know. It's called Everything You Need to Know to Enjoy Beer Even More.
There you go.
And for more advanced people, for homebrewers, the one section that they have mentioned to me they find super helpful is in the appendix. And it's not surprising to me that they find it helpful. I have this chart here, ale versus lagers. Then I have here a comparison of all the ABVs of all the styles, all the colors.
Oh, nice.
And then I get into style comparison charts. And
wow.
It's not surprising to me that people who are homebrewing and who are into BJCP and studying beer find these helpful, because these are charts I created when I was studying for the BJCP exam. Nice. And the first time I sat for the BJCP exam, I got over an 80, which automatically qualified me for the national status. But it was through using these.
And the exam is very hard, I ought to mention, for those of you that don't know. It's challenging, right?
Yeah. So at the time, the exam was different. So at the time when I started, there wasn't as much interest in the BJCP. So you would sit down and do the written and the tasting at the same time, and then you would get your grade. Now the process is by step. So you start with just understanding of the styles and an online exam, which qualifies you to start judging. And then as you gain experience, then you can sit down for the tasting exam. And then as you gain more experience, you sit down for the written exam. So they ease you in a lot more. And again, I'm always letting people hesitate to become judges. And I certainly think it's important to learn the guidelines, but beyond that, just jump in, do it. You can be an apprentice judge, sit down with 2 other experienced judges. That's the best way that you'll learn. And it's an invaluable experience. And but at the time I did do it, it was a grueling exam. I remember I had the clock because you have to, time management is critical there. There's one more thing I did want to mention about my book, because I think it's very important. It's slightly BJCP related. And that is that in my styles, and this, obviously can be used as a quick reference guide. You can see I have a snapshot, I don't know, of whether each beer is this is all backwards. Anyway, if it's an ale or a lager, the color, so on and so forth. But I also have, like the BJCP, a classic examples section. So when I was studying for the BJCP, as a Canadian, I found it challenging to round up all the styles. I think it took me 6 or 7 years to find a classic example of every single style in the BJCP, and there's still one missing. And so when I created this book...
Yeah, I believe there's over 100 styles now, right? So, I mean, it does take time.
It takes time, and also a lot of the classic examples are either only available in Europe or only available in the US. So I literally did not have access and had to travel. And every time I left the country, I'd beeline to a beer store and sort of see what was available and try to, complete my collection, so to speak. So what I wanted to mention about my book is that this is a North America release. A lot of people see that I'm Canadian and assume that it's a Canadian-specific book.
Sure.
It's a North American release. I knew it was going to be released throughout Canada and the US. So in my classic examples, I went out of my way to make sure that it doesn't matter where you are in Canada or the US, you can find at least one of the beers in that classic example. And furthermore, I will let you know that it took me as long just to create those style example lists as it took me to write the entirety of the book.
Wow. Yeah.
So I put a lot of work into that, and I'm really hopeful that it'll be a resource to people. My main goal, again, is just to help people understand every different style and to be able to go to the store and grab an example and taste along and understand what that is. It's a very practical, hands-on guide. A lot of breweries actually, not breweries, pubs will just have it in the back bar as a quick reference.
And we're actually running a little short on time, but maybe just a minute or so on your website as well, which is beerology.ca, I should mention. I'm going to put it up on the up here for a minute while you're talking.
I'm Beerology everywhere, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I have YouTube videos now, which are tons of fun. But yes, my website is beerology.ca. And it's mostly about me and the work that I do for Beerology. I founded in 2008. Mm-hmm. And when I started, I was doing these guided tastings, as I mentioned. And now I'm transitioning more into a consulting role. So in terms of the off-flavor classes that I was teaching, now I've transitioned into assisting breweries in building and troubleshooting their sensory program. And that's very stimulating and fun. And then with the teaching side, I've started now creating training programs and training the trainer. So my most recent project I was delighted with. We just started in Ontario having beer in grocery stores. It was not legal until very recently. Yeah,
you had to go to a package store, right, of some kind?
Yeah, to the LCBO, the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, or the beer store. So I partnered with the Ontario Craft Brewers Association, and they had me hire a group of beer sommeliers and train them, and then put them in stores so that people who are just shopping, minding their own business, would get to the beer aisle and suddenly have this expert who could guide them in their selection. And, I worked with the team and with the OCB managing that project. It was tons of fun. I learned a lot, and customers were delighted with that. I mean, It's
Great.
interesting because I think it's something that all of us do anyway. Certainly when I'm at the liquor store and someone's in front of the beer looking confused, I'll just jump in there and, hey, can I help you out? So the Cicerones who were in aisle had tons of fun with it. And it's just a fantastic project, which is, promoting beer appreciation, which is what I'm trying to do in all my work. Very exciting.
Well, Mirella, really appreciate you coming on the show. Thanks for coming on as a first-time guest. Enjoyed having you.
Me. Yes.
Yeah. And again, my guest today was Marella Amato. She's a national-level Bjcp certified beer judge and one of the few master cicerones as well. You can find her book, Beerology, as well as learn more about her website at beerology.ca. Thanks again, Marella.
Thank you.
A big thank you to Marella Amato for joining me this week. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They have a new podcast called the Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine Podcast, which I encourage you to check out. It features some of the top craft brewery owners and brewmasters discussing brewing techniques and flavors in beer. It's the podcast for those who make and drink great beer. You can find it on iTunes or beerandbrewing.com/podcasts. And also Bleakman Engineering, creators of the innovative new BrewVision wireless thermometer. Remotely monitor your brewing system from your iPhone or iPad, record data, set alerts, and grab recipes directly from BeerSmith. The BrewVision thermometer, another great innovation from BleakmanEngineering.com. And finally, BeerSmith 3 is available for download. BeerSmith 3 adds Mead, wine, and cider support, new Whirlpool hop options, support for high-altitude brewing, and a whole lot more. Check out BeerSmith 3 and get your free 21-day trial today from BeerSmith.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great brewing week.